Hey AP Stats students, we are starting our third chapter, moving into our second unit of AP Statistics. In that first unit, in those first two chapters, we focused on single variable data, right, one variable. Now we are looking into exploring two variable data. When you have two specifically quantitative variable datas, we're going to be looking at scatterplots and correlations, and that's what this first section is going to be focusing on. Here are the learning targets that we are hoping to accomplish by the end of these videos. The first video, I definitely will be talking about the first maybe 2 or 3 of these. We'll see how far we can get. Now remember, from the last chapter, we had 4 steps for when we were working with our quantitative data, right? We always wanted to plot the data. It's usually a dot plot or a stem plot, maybe a histogram. We looked for the overall pattern. We talked about our shape, our outliers, our center, and our variability or our spread. We did different numerical summaries that we calculated for both center and for the variability. And then if there was, such a large quantity that was in a regular pattern, we used that density curve to describe it. Now, the big picture process for evaluating relationships is not going to be different between 1 or 2 variables. We're still going to do the same things. We're still going to plot it. We're still going to use numerical summaries. We're still going to look for overall patterns and deviations from those patterns. And then again, if there is a regular overall pattern, we're going to use some simplified model to describe it. In this case, we're going to use a line of best fit, but that'll be in the next section. Now, when we have 2 variables, they're going to represent different things, okay? We're going to have a response variable and an explanatory variable. The response variable is going to measure the outcome of a study. So, for example, you plant some tomatoes and the plant growth is going to be your response variable. This is usually graphed or plotted, represented on the y-axis. Your explanatory variable is going to be shown on your x-axis, and this can either predict or explain the changes in the response variable. So for those tomato plants that you grew, the amount of rain might explain the plant growth. We want to stay away from the term independent here, just because independent can mean something different, so we're going to use explanatory instead. So here's a quick little note. In many studies, the goal is to show that changes in 1 or more explanatory variables can actually cause changes in the response. So for the tomato plants, does the amount of rain cause or explain that plant growth, right? If I have a lot of rain, am I going to have really tall tomato plants or vice versa? However, other explanatory response relationships don't involve direct causation. Okay, so just because there's a relationship between 2 things doesn't mean that one caused the other. That's going to be a common theme. Here's some more examples of explanatory and response variables. I do say independent here versus dependent. That's kind of traditionally how we think about it, but we're not going to say that. It can just help you for understanding what goes with what. So for example, car weight might explain accident death rate. Number of cigarettes smoked, might explain your life expectancy. Same thing, number of hours studied versus SAT scores, right? This one kind of depends on that one sometimes, right? And I'm not saying, again, this doesn't cause this one to be high or low or whatever, but there might be a relationship there. I wouldn't say the other way around. That's all I'm saying. All right, let's do 2 examples. For Julie and Jim, we want to identify the explanatory variable and the response variable if it's possible. There will be some instances where it's not obvious what the explanatory or response variables are. Okay? In this example, Julie wants to know if she can predict a student's weight from his or her height. Information about height is easier to obtain than information about weight. Jim wants to know if there's a relationship between height and weight. All right, what are we thinking? Well, Julie is treating a student's height as the explanatory variable and the student's weight as the response variable. Jim is just interested in exploring the relationship between the 2 variables, so there is no clear explanatory response based on Jim. Okay, so Julie wants to know if one can predict the other, whereas Jim just wants to know if there's a relationship between the 2. All right, this one's slightly different. To study the effect of alcohol on body temperature, Julie gave several different amounts of alcohol to mice in an experiment. After 15 minutes, she measured the change in each mouse's body temperature. So what could be the explanatory and what could be the response? The amount of alcohol is the explanatory variable, and the change in body temperature is the response variable. Here's an important note. It would not be enough to simply say that alcohol is explanatory or to say that temperature is the response. We need to have, what are we measuring? We're measuring the amount of alcohol, not just the presence of alcohol, but how much is given. Same thing. It's not whether or not they have a temperature, it's the change in the body temperature. How much did it change, not just temperature in general. So make sure you're being specific enough when you're labeling and describing your explanatory and your response variables. Now, when you have these two sets of quantitative data, you can display them in a scatter plot. A scatter plot shows the relationship, or the association, between two quantitative variables measured on the same individuals. Okay? The values of one variable appear on the horizontal axis, and then the values of the other on the vertical. Each individual in the data appears as a point on the graph. Okay? So each individual point represents one singular individual from the data set. Please note that your axes do not need to start at 0. In fact, if it doesn't make sense to start at 0, don't do it. As you can see here, we're looking at mean math scores. I'm assuming SAT scores here. Yeah, because we're talking SATs. It wouldn't make sense to start at 0, right? The lowest value here is a little bit above 450, so they started at 450. They don't have every single value listed as far as every tick mark, so you do just have to be close with your graphing, but it doesn't need to be perfectly exact as far as like, oh, I can perfectly find this value. It's going to be more of an estimating. When you're making a scatter plot, here are the steps that you're going to do. First thing, you want to label your axes as far as, names. So the explanatory variable goes on the horizontal axis. Easy way to remember that. Explanatory has an X in it. And the response variable goes on the vertical axis. If there is no clear explanatory variable, then it can go in either place. Next thing you want to do is you want to scale your axes. So place equally spaced tick marks along each axis, beginning at a convenient number just below the smallest value of the variable and continuing until you exceed the largest. Next thing you have to do is you want to plot your individual data values. We're not connecting them. We're not drawing a line. We're just plotting them, right? A scatter plot is just a collection of data points on a graph. There is no necessarily line present. Things that everyone forgets is they forget to label, right? I love this little cartoon. I think we should give it another shot. We should break up and I can prove it. And look at her graph. Oh, it's lovely. But he's like, maybe you were right. He's like, I don't think I can be with someone that doesn't label her axes. Don't be like her. Label your axes, friends. All right, we're going to do an example of making a scatter plot. So this data represents 9th grade students at the Webb School that are going on a backpacking trip. The students are divided into groups of 8. It's done randomly by selecting names from a hat. Before they left, the students and their backpacks are weighed. So here's the data from one of the groups. We want to make a scatter plot of the relationship between body weight and pack weight. We're going to use body weight as our explanatory variable, which makes sense, right? The backpack weight could be explained by their body weight. I would assume, if I was just guessing, that the more somebody weighs, the heavier their pack could be. But that's just my prediction. I don't know if that's true or not. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make an x-axis, right, for our body weight. I'm starting, from like 110, like it got cut off a little bit, but this is like 100. So from like 100 to 190 from my scale here, right, because my lowest, it looks like, is 103. So if I started at 100 versus 187, so I went to 190. Then I would make my vertical scale. Backpack weight ranges from about 24 to 35. So I scaled it there. Notice I didn't count the same on either one. That's fine. And then from there, I just plot each point. Okay? So go ahead and make this graph on yours. You'll probably need to pause the video so that you can recreate this scatter plot in your notes. From the scatter plot, I can see you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, because there were 8 data entries up here. Notice how it's 8 pairs of entries, not just 16 data points, so it's 8 points on my scatter plot. Each point corresponds to a particular value. So for instance, someone that weighed 120 pounds and had a backpack weight of 26, you can see their value right here. You don't need to have these dotted lines. This is just for the purpose of me showing you, hey, here's how I found that point. If you're interested in making scatter plots on your calculator, these are the calculator instructions for it. These are in your notes. This could be helpful for you, but don't waste your time if calculator instructions aren't easily memorized for you. You're either going to be provided a scatter plot or you're going to have to just do one by hand. But if you're interested in how to do it on a calculator, you can do it here. There's also that website, scatterplot.com, where you can always make a scatter plot there. All right, I am going to stop this video, and then in our next video, we're going to talk about how do you describe and interpret a scatter plot. So before in Unit 1, we had our socks. Now we're going to have something new. So stay tuned for the next video.